It is on, and thank you guys again. Let me get my talk up before something else happens. And there it is there. And I'm going to put it in viewer mode. Okay. Let's see. All right, can everybody see it? So I want to thank you again for your patience, and I'm sorry about all the computer glitches, and also for spending part of your day or evening with me as I talk about zoonotic diseases of marine organisms. And thank you also to the American Cetacean Society, the San Diego chapter, for inviting me to give this presentation. So we're going to follow this general outline, and we're going to talk a little bit about my background very briefly, how I got to where I am and to this field of study. We'll talk about zoonoses and give a little bit of a overview of what that means, what the definition is, talk about the One Health concept, how it fits in with zoonoses and epidemiology. Then we'll talk about transmission routes for a majority of these diseases in the aquatic environment. And then we'll jump into the different classes of animals and potential diseases that humans can get from them. And then we'll wrap it up with some control and prevention measures. So I grew up in the Texas area, Dallas, landlocked Dallas. I was born in North Carolina, but moved to Texas, went to Texas A&M University. And then after vet school, well, during my time in Texas, I developed a big interest in marine mammals, and aquatic animals in general with Jacques Cousteau. So I moved to California and started working in marine mammal rehab work there, and became interested in diseases and how they occur in populations. Ended up moving up to Washington State. During my time there, I worked in the stranding office for marine mammal strandings with NOAA Fisheries, and became very intrigued with disease outbreaks and why some populations had it and some others did not. And while I was there, I got my master's degree in epidemiology and looking at sea lions diseases. And then I am a glutton for punishment. I didn't have enough schooling, I guess, and I went and flew back and forth between Seattle and Sacramento to go to school at UC Davis to get my PhD in wildlife epidemiology, again, in aquatic animals. And then after finishing that PhD, I did a one-year postdoctoral fellowship at Baylor University. And that was from 2015 to 2016. So I'm back in the Seattle area in the Northwest. So some of these diseases might be a little bit Northwest centric, and I'll point that out when that does occur. So as I mentioned with my DDM degree, it's equivalent to something like an MD. We look at a patient, we diagnose diseases, we try to figure out what's wrong with an animal, we try to find preventative measures to help mitigate disease. So we could give vaccinations, routine healthcare exams, that type of thing. But as I mentioned, I wanted to sort of take it the next step and see what would happen at a population level. Again, why do these guys get diseases and others don't? So that's where the epidemiology fits in. It's essentially looking at health of animals, but at a population level, and it applies to people too. And I also wanted to be able to conduct, some pretty complex studies and collaborate with people who are doing complex studies in using quantitative methods. So it's very math heavy, a lot of statistical analyses, data science, working with people in different fields. And a lot of these are research studies that then end up in these scientific publications. But how does that really help a population? Well, what I'm really interested in is the applicable solution side of things, where we can take those solutions and we can try to apply them to real world situations to try to help the animals that we're interested in. So zoonoses, and you may have heard this term more often now because of the COVID situation, but what zoonotic disease is, when we talk about them, most often it's talking about diseases going from animals to humans. And it can work both ways. As you see from this diagram, you can have some diseases, and we'll mention a couple of them in this presentation, that can go both ways. But usually we're dealing with things going from the left to right. So from animals to people. It can be pathogens, it can be parasites, it can be fungal organisms, viruses, a number of things. And I was kind of curious. I thought, well, I wonder what the CD's thinking nowadays, what their top 10, sort of like David Letterman and his top 10 list of things. I wanted to know what they considered right now for the US as the top concerns of zoonotic diseases. And interestingly, a couple of these we're going to talk about tonight, influenza and brucellosis. These are viral disease and a bacterial disease. But because we're in the age of COVID, we are going to mention coronaviruses. And salmonella, I won't talk about specifically, but it is something that can go from animals to humans, and most people have heard of salmonella. So these, at least we'll have a couple of these that we'll hit on tonight. So I like this saying when I'm thinking about One Health, and this is an easy way to think about it, is if you're going to address, human and or environmental health, you really have to be able to address what's happening in the animal world. And the same can be said about any other approach. Like if you want to look at animal health, you have to look at human and environmental health. And the reason being is that we have what's called this triad. So essentially what we're saying here is that human, environmental, and animal health are inextricably linked together. So you really can't look at one aspect of it, one sector, without addressing either one or two of the others. And so you want to keep that in mind as we go through some of these diseases tonight and see how One Health fits into that. And so just looking at the strict definition of it, or one of many definitions, it's a transdisciplinary approach through which organizations or agencies or individuals promote and try to improve cooperation and collaboration when you're looking at a specific health condition or disease. And so what we do is we bring these three together to try to solve a problem. And now when you're looking at things like One Health, and this EID stands for Emerging Infectious Diseases, you really have to be able to step back and understand and respond to, say, ecological, social, and economic conditions that can facilitate the emergence of diseases, because the human footprint is worldwide. And so a lot of these conditions are going to impact what type of diseases we see emerging. And these are common characteristics of today's emerging infectious diseases. And there was a study done back in about mid-2000s they wanted to look at a specific time period here, and they chose about a 65-year period from 1940 to 2004. And what they were interested in is they wanted to see what proportion of emerging infectious diseases can be attributed to zoonotic diseases. And they found over half, so about 60%, were attributable to some animal source. And of those 60%, almost 3/4 of those were attributed to wildlife. So essentially what it's telling us is that it's really, we're having this emergence of diseases that can be traced back to animals. And one of the things they wanted to make sure they accounted for was increased surveillance. So we're getting better and better over the years in doing surveillance for these. And even when you take that into account, there was a true increase in wildlife associated zoonotic diseases. So we're seeing more of these. And so what this is all telling us is that it's going to be really important for us to include all three sectors, and it's going to become a global concern with these emerging infectious diseases. So we want to approach it from this One Health perspective. Now, epidemiology is sort of the area that I'm involved in. It's near and dear to my heart. And what this is sort of a simple definition. It's studying the distribution and determinants of any health-related state or event. And that includes diseases, it can include traffic accidents, it can include whatever health concern you want to look at. And then you apply this study to the control or mitigation of that disease or other health problems. And this is what the World Health Organization has as a definition. So being in public health, we seem to like these triads. So we have to look at it in the form of this triangle, because when you look at a disease or a health condition, there are at least three different determinants that are going to affect what the outcome of that disease is and how it shows up in a population. It's host and environment, and also the agent. So when we describe the host, we look at several factors.
Somebody needs to mute. We have some competition.
There we go.
One person that's not muted. Thank you.
There you go. Anyway, I'll try to talk over it. So when we look at the host, we look at different factors, demographic factors, the age, the sex, what the genetic profile might be, what's immune status. And when we look at agents, these can be either biological, they can be chemical, they can be nutritional. So it doesn't have to necessarily just be a pathogen that you're talking about, such as bacteria. And this last sector, the environment, this is where we really try to look at how there are linkages between animal, human, environmental health. So we can look at environmental factors such as temperature, humidity, crowding, housing, water, any type of thing that might be in the environment that would affect this disease. So epidemiology, again, just kind of a quick summary, is we're looking at what determinants either protect or make a population at risk for getting a certain health condition. So how does that fit into aquatic animals in this One Health concept? Well, what this allows us to do a number of things, and I have a list of 4 of the most common. It's not entirely inclusive of everything, but just sort of easy things that we hear a lot about. One is that we can look at the causes of diseases or health condition, and this can often occur in the form of responding to a disease outbreak. You know, we want to look at what factors this person was or animal was exposed to before the disease showed up. We can also determine quantitatively the probability of occurrence of disease, injuries, or death. So we can come up with actual figures like risk, relative risk, which is an actual number. We can come up with a probability or the odds of occurrence of disease. So it helps us better define what a quantitative measure of disease risk. We can describe the health status of a population or group. This tends to be more of a descriptive exercise where we just say, all right, this population of dolphins has this proportion of disease, based on X factors. Lastly here, we can do surveillance on the prevalence, and probably have heard about that a lot with this COVID. That's the proportion of a population at a given time that has that disease. We can also look at incidence of disease. This is more of a measure of how many new cases that you get over a certain time period. So how many new cases of salmonella over a week's time. It's a measure over time. So that's incidence. So when we talk about aquatic organisms, just looking at our big planet out there, we know that at least almost 3/4 of the Earth is covered in water, and we as humans have a really intricate relationship with our aquatic environment ever since we have been around on this planet. And we use it for recreation, we use it for fishing, agriculture, natural resource extraction, also trying to extract medicinal compounds from it. So it's not a complete list, but you can get an idea that we really, really depend on this matrix for our very survival. Now, given that, we have to have a healthy respect for it, also knowing that there are organisms out there that are potentially zoonotic, that can come from the environment and animals that live there to us. And there are some diseases that I'll be talking about as we go through the different conditions that are common to both marine and freshwater, and I'll point those out. I'll be focusing more on the marine. That's just my background. And given that this is a very, very dynamic matrix, so you've got tides, you've got currents, you've got storms, you've got animals that move around, that migrate to different parts of the ocean basins, really present some unique challenges when you're trying to identify and study diseases in these populations. But given all this, interestingly, in looking at past studies and reading about diseases in the aquatic organism by disease ecologists, those are like epi people for the environment, there's actually a low incidence of transmission compared to, say, terrestrial zoonotic diseases. And a couple of reasons may explain that. One is that maybe we don't recognize all the diseases that are out there, but also too, you've got to remember that you've got a matrix that can dilute things pretty quickly. So if you put in a spoonful of salmonella bacteria, it's going to dilute that pretty quickly. Doesn't mean we're not going to have transmission. It just means it's a little bit lower than we might see on the terrestrial part. Now, as far as transmission routes, there are multiple as there are in any disease, but you'll notice a pattern as we go through the next few slides that there will be a couple of different routes that are most common. Ingestion of contaminated tissues or water. So if you have an animal that's sick, carries this organism, you might eat it not unknowingly, and then you become sick. But also contamination of broken skin. So if you're out there and you get a cut or have a new tattoo, that hasn't healed yet. Those are all open ports that organisms can go into and infect you that way. But there's also things like aerosol or inhalation that you can get organisms from. Just a little bit more about pathogen transmission, because it's such a unique environment. The interaction of pathogens between humans and aquatic species, is quite complex, and the same can probably be said for terrestrial. But given that we have this really dynamic water environment that's always in flux, and we have various transmission routes, it does present a bit of a complexity. And there are many zoonotic pathogens for which we really don't have disease in aquatic species. In other words, it doesn't really affect the animal from which we actually get the disease from. We can have seemingly healthy fish that can transmit to humans. They may just be perfectly healthy, but if you touch it, you pick up something. If maybe your immune system is suppressed a little bit, or you're in distress, or you have a cut, it can enter that way. We have commensal organisms. These are organisms that live on the animal, don't really cause a problem. They just hitch a ride, or they just are there to make it easier to collect food. They may cause few problems in that aquatic species, but they can be zoonotic to humans. Many clinical signs of the disease can show up in aquatic species. They may get certain viruses or bacterial infections, but really don't have any relevance to us and our health. So it affects the animal, but not necessarily us. And the kind of an interesting point, just sort of a little aside, is that in reading through the literature and being involved in this field for a while, one of the interesting things that comes out of this, those infections that are acquired exclusively through contact only, in other words, you don't ingest it, you get it only through contact is how you get it. These tend to be primarily diseases that involve bacteria versus, say, a parasite or a fungus. It's not across the board 100%, but it is kind of an interesting little tidbit on aquatic diseases. So what I want to do is, before I start into shellfish, our first group, I just want to preface this whole entire talk is this is not going to be a complete list of everything that's out there. We're not going to get into great detail in each one of these, just in the interest of time, but it's just going to touch on some of the more common diseases that you may have heard of, or you may come across and say, oh yeah, I remember she talked about that. So just so you know, but it's just a quick kind of go through, and we'll just touch on them briefly. And if you want to know more, there's always the internet, Google, Dr. Google. So our first group was shellfish. Now this includes not only mollusks like clams and oysters, but you want to also think about crabs, lobsters, and shrimp. So when we talk about shellfish, I include those in there with them. We have a list here of all our poisonings, so to speak, and the first one is paralytic shellfish poisoning, causes neurological symptoms such as paralysis and death. And what it is when we ingest the saxitoxin, which is produced by this dinoflagellate. And these dinoflagellates are, you can kind of think of them as marine plankton. They're really tiny, they're microscopic, but they can be bioaccumulated or filtered and concentrated in these shellfish. And so when we have mammals come along and eat them, or a human, you can obviously see we can get sick that way, and depending on the dose and what our health is like. And the thing with saxitoxin, and you'll find a lot of these, is that they're not necessarily inactivated by heat. So when we have a warning, when we have blooms and there's a warning not to eat, we definitely want to heed those and just try to get our shellfish from other areas that are not affected by an ongoing bloom. Neurotoxic shellfish poisoning. This is another one of those neurological ones that can affect the nervous system, causing numbness, gastrointestinal disturbances, vomiting, diarrhea, that type of thing. Myalgia, where we have achy muscles and joints. It's caused by brevetoxin. Again, it's produced by the dinoflagellate. We can have concentrations of it in shellfish. We can have large fish kills. So we see this a lot in, say, southeastern United States, in these warm areas where we get these big blooms. We've heard of manatees getting exposed to this, dolphins can, humans. So not only us as humans get affected, but also any animals that consume these. Amnesic shellfish poisoning. This is probably well known to those of us on the West Coast, particularly with sea lions. It's the one that produces, caused by domoic acid, the diatom, pseudonychia. Also, we can get fish kills with this, be affected in shellfish, but it can cause some gastrointestinal symptoms, but really its big one is like neurological, can have memory loss. You get those sea lion photos, we used to think, oh, they're just kind of wandering in the little towns, they forgot where they are, or they just enjoy going in towns. But what they found on these animals is that the parts of the brain that affect memory were affected by this toxin. And so it essentially was looking at memory loss, and this can happen in humans. So I know this can be deactivated or it can leach out after cooking for a while to decrease the amount of it in shellfish, but I just would probably want to stay away from anything that it's coming from an active bloom. And this last one is diuretic shellfish poisoning, so named because it can cause primarily diarrhea. So again, not one of these fun things you want to get, vomiting, cramps. But this one is usually mild, caused by okadaic acid. Again, another dinoflagellate, and accumulates in shellfish. And we did have an outbreak of this in up here in Washington State in 2011 that was traced back to a shellfish bed that had a bloom of okadaic acid. We don't see it a whole lot blooming. We do get cases of it, but we don't see these large blooms a lot. But it's just interesting because we don't consider the Northwest warm water. So it can occur when we do get these anomalies or these unusual warm water events. Now this little creature here is a bacteria. It's not a plankton, but it's a bacteria that has a high affinity for high salinity waters. It can be found in marine and brackish waters. And brackish waters are where we have the salt water meeting the fresh water and these estuaries where it kind of mixes together like that. The most common, there are many types of Vibrio species and they can all cause disease, but the ones that we most worry about in humans are these three right here, vulnificus, parahemolyticus, and cholera. And they do tend to proliferate in warm water. So even in the Northwest here, we'll have background cases that show up, you know, in other not so warm months, but during the summer, June, July, August, and September, we'll have these spikes where we'll have an increase in cases. People are out eating shellfish more. They're on the beach. They may pop one of those in there raw and they can get it. So the interesting thing about this though, the Vibrios, because they're found everywhere in the marine environment, we can actually culture them from the skin surfaces and the gastrointestinal tract in clinically normal fish and shellfish. But when these guys come under stress, so whether they're crowded or the water's too warm for them, they can actually get disease too from Vibrio. And clinical signs though with this disease in fish though, especially if it's mild, really looks like a lot of other diseases in fish. So you can't go out there and say, yeah, this fish has Vibrio, it's not looking so good. So it's not a really reliable indicator to help prevent us from getting it. So with humans, the way we get these, with the vulnificus, this is the most commonly fish-derived zoonotic disease that we have, at least in the United States. Typically it's through skin puncture or ingestion. You get this necrotizing fasciitis, so essentially it's gangrene of the soft tissues. You can get septicemia, blood infection, a pretty high mortality rate of about 50 to 60% mortality. And these are the kind of cases that you'll hear about. Oh, you get 1 to 2 every year where you'll have, sorry about that, you'll have, you know, if someone has gotten a brand new tattoo and they go out before it's healed up, they'll go out in the Gulf of Mexico and next thing you know, they got this horrible disease and they die. Or you'll get fishermen that have gone out or they get scratched by some cuts from oyster shells, or someone's gotten hooked by a hook. They've been handling fish, out fishing in these warm waters, and then they get this awful disease and they have to have things amputated. This is what we're dealing with, this vulnificus. So next time you hear those stories, you'll look in the text and you'll see this. This is pretty nasty. We don't see it a lot, but we see it enough that it's a bad one. Parahemolyticus is a very commonly derived, a shellfish-derived disease. It's found in oyster beds, and we see it in the Northwest. In fact, the Northwest here in Washington State, we had in British Columbia, we were like #2 behind the Chesapeake Bay area for production of shellfish. And so our shellfish go all over the country. And every once in a while, we'll get these outbreaks when we have the Vibrio levels in the shellfish exceed a level that would not necessarily cause us harm. And when we do get it, luckily it's usually short duration unless you have some underlying health conditions, but it can cause GI illness. And so it tends to be a little underreported. Now, cholera, which I'm not going to talk about very much, but you've heard about cholera. It's the cholera we hear after natural disasters when there's poor sanitation and there's spread of this organism all over the place, and people get sick and die from that. So when you hear about cholera, that's who this is caused by. All right, so we'll talk about fish pathogens, and Aeromonas is one of our pretty common ones. It's a ubiquitous bacteria in aquatic and terrestrial environment. It occurs both in marine and freshwater, but the interesting thing is it also occurs on land. And it's frequently cultured in pet fish, ornamental fish like koi ponds, or anything that's going to be in a crowded condition, like pet stores. You might see that, not to knock on pet stores, but when you go to like PetSmart, see a lot of fish in there. If you get one animal that's got it, it can go through. But this is often secondary to other stressors, whether it's overcrowding, whether it's poor nutrition. So this is when it can come out. But again, in these fish, it's really just this non-specific, it's got this ulcer, which can be a sign of many other different diseases in fish. So it's not really reliable to diagnose it. In humans, how we usually get it is from, again, contact abrasions with the mucus of the surface of the fish that has a disease, or tissues from the infected carrier fish. Now, if you're a healthy individual, it will cause some gastroenteritis. Our poor guts are going to get affected by a lot of these organisms, as you'll see. But you can also get this localized wound swelling, and you can have secondary problems with that if it gets untreated or not looked after. Now, this one is one that I think is kind of a nasty little bug, Mycobacterium, and it is found again in marine and freshwater. There are a couple of different varieties in the fish world that we worry about, Fortuatum and Marinum. And in the fish world, the people that work with fish a lot, they'll call it fish handlers nodules, because they will get these nodules like you see on this fish, the little hard bumps on the outside. You'll get them on your fingers, typically a month and a half to 2 months after exposure, so not necessarily right away. If you are immunocompromised or stressed or have some other underlying condition, or it's not properly treated and looked at, then it can also spread to the lymph nodes, and you can have some secondary problems that way. And this little pictograph on the right is a picture of the cleaner, like there are little fish, cleaner fish that will clean your feet, little dead cells off your feet and skin. And they used to have them in the United States, but the CDC wisely banned those because of the risk and the concern about catching something like Mycobacterium. When I go down to Mexico every year, I help teach a class on marine diseases for veterinary students interested in this takes place down in south of Cancun, and they have these little stands everywhere. And I've been so tempted because I think it'd be kind of neat to do it. I've never had it done, but I just always remember these Mycobacterium. And these are kind of related to the tuberculosis bacteria that we'll talk about under marine mammals. So just remember these when we get to that part. Now, this is not a bacteria. It's another one of those marine toxins called Ciguetera. It can cause some interesting symptoms, numbness of the lips and mouth, achy joints. But really what's very kind of cool about this, maybe not for the patient, but it causes something called a paradoxical temperature reversal. So where on your body you might feel like cold fingers, it will feel warm to you, and vice versa. So you have this opposite of feeling of temperature sensation. And why that is, probably something to do with the nervous system. Caused by ciguetoxin, again, another one of these marine plankton organisms, but this one tends to accumulate in reef fish versus things like shellfish. So you will often go down to the Southeast United States, Caribbean, South Pacific, anywhere you've got reefs, you see these signs, be really wary and look at these species that can be affected. They'll bioaccumulate these, they'll eat on the reef, they'll eat near the reef or eat pieces of the reef, and the coral, and they'll ingest this dinoflagellate, and they'll bioaccumulate in their bodies. They don't necessarily get affected, the fish don't, by the toxin. If you do ingest a fish that has this toxin, the onset of signs is pretty quick. It's like 1 to 3 hours versus some of these others might take a day or two. And it's one of the most commonly reported algae-related seafood illnesses in the world, and they're projected to increase the number of cases due to warming temperatures in our oceans. Now, the difficulty, though, sometimes in diagnosing is there's really no human biomarker to detect the to detect the toxins. So what we have to rely on, history of consumption of fish and just sort of clinical signs. But one of the interesting things about this too is that we have to differentiate it from multiple sclerosis because they have very similar symptoms. And I have a kind of a quick story about this. I did some work at a nonprofit vet clinic down in the Cook Islands in the South Pacific a number of years ago. And patients or owners would bring in their patients, their kittens, and they would eat the scraps. The kittens would eat the scraps of fish that the owners who had fished and had caught fishing, and they'd clean the fish and throw the scraps to the cats. Well, the kittens would eat this. It'd be contaminated with Ciguetera, and then they would be paralyzed. They could still breathe and eat and swallow. They just couldn't move. So we'd have to take care of these and force feed them and provide them supportive care. And sometimes it took a couple of 3 weeks for them to come out of it. And sometimes the owners would come in with, numb arms or paralyzed arms, having eaten some of it. But they were interesting. They claimed that they were pretty good about detecting where on the reef to avoid the fish, so they'd decrease the likelihood of catching this Ciguetera. I don't know. I don't think I'd want to risk that. But anyway, they were pretty good at it. So now we'll move on to marine mammal pathogens. So, why do we all care about marine mammals. A lot of us have, very strong emotions about them. And they're actually our closest oceanic relatives, and they're great sentinel species, canary in the coal mines for ocean and human health. So if we have diseases that break out over there, we, are concerned about that. We'll look into that because it could impact us also. They're long-lived by us. They eat the top, or like us, and they're top-tier food predators like us. So we eat at the top of the food chain. They also inhabit some of the similar inshore environments that we do along the coast. So we share a lot of the same waters with them, and they're very, obviously beloved by the general public. So we care about them. Who doesn't like a cute little harbor seal pup? Except at stranding time, there's so many of them. And then, little humpback calves. So we care about these animals, and we're interested in what affects them. So back to this Mycobacterium that we talked a little bit about in fish earlier. So this is part of what we call a Mycobacterium tuberculosis complex. It's a set of tuberculosis organisms, one of which includes one for pinnipeds. And one of the things I forgot to mention at the beginning of this is that we know this is a cetacean organization, but I'm also talking obviously about other species. So some of these might just be delegated to pinnipeds, like this particular disease. But because these are all genetically related to each other, the human tuberculosis and the seal and sea lion tuberculosis, we assume that humans can be affected by the pinniped version of the tuberculosis organism, and pinnipeds can be affected by ours. So with humans, they can get infected through direct contact with mucus if the animal's coughing, the sea lion, especially if there's like a subclinical case and you're not maybe suspecting tuberculosis yet. We can get exposure if we're tending to a sick animal that does have tuberculosis, even if we, don our protective equipment. Also, we can be injured during necropsies, which are essentially autopsies for animals. So if we accidentally, we break a rib in order to get to the organs inside the chest cavity. If we accidentally cut ourselves on that glove and it breaks, we can scratch ourselves that way and get inoculated by this. So it's definitely one of these diseases that you don't want to get. And so I told myself I'd only do 2 gross pictures. And so this is one of them coming up, and I apologize if it makes some of you, if you don't want to see it, it's lungs of an animal affected by it. And this is a sea lion that ended up having a case of tuberculosis, and it's, they just don't do well. They may cough a lot, they may not, they may just, slowly wither away and die. And on the right, we have a harbor porpoise, so a type of cetacean that was diagnosed with Mycobacterium. And this is something that is really, I think, quite dramatic. On the lung up here on the top, as you can see, is obviously the affected one. This one's not looking so much better. But each of these nodules, what the bacteria does, it forms tubercles, hence the name tuberculosis. And inside the tubercles are the organisms. And so it makes it really, really difficult to treat these. So when humans get it, we have to go on antibiotics a long time. Sometimes it can be, months and months, or even getting to years. And with this, we've heard it literally consumes the lungs. And so that's kind of where we get some of the name of consumption from when we had human tuberculosis cases, and it was a very widespread problem. It is something that can form antibiotic resistance, and so it is a difficult organism to treat, and we treat it with a lot of respect. And so far, at least in the Northwest, we haven't seen any cases, and hopefully we won't. Now, Brucella is another interesting organism. It's another bacteria found in both marine and brackish waters. It persists in the environment, so we can isolate it from healthy animals. Doesn't mean all healthy animals have it, but if you have a healthy animal, clinically it's fine, and you happen to isolate this organism from it and it doesn't show any other signs, any abscesses or anything like that, it can be considered a normal part of that animal's microbiome. Now, it was first recorded in marine mammals and bottlenose dolphin and an aborted fetus back in 1994. It doesn't mean it was not there beforehand. That's when we first recognized it. But it's different. It's very distinct, the marine versions, from the 6 terrestrial versions. So in terrestrial, we have cow, Brucella, we have dog, sheep, goat, and also pig. So we have very distinct strains. In marine mammals, at least for now, we've grouped them into 2 different strains, seals, sea lions, and walruses, and then the cetacean version, which are whales, dolphins, and porpoises. So with transmission in marine mammals, you can presume that it could likely transmit the same way in humans. We don't know yet, but we assume it's very similar based on how it happens in terrestrial animals. So we can have contact with reproductive fluids, whether you have an aborted fetus, birth fluids venereally, so sexually transmitted through milk. So a mom can give it to her baby in utero, so it can pass, you know, while the baby's in the uterus. Now the question here, and this has not been completely worked out, whether ingestion of infected fish, other marine mammal tissue, or shellfish could play a role in transmission. Fecal contact is certainly one that we've seen with the pinniped version. It's been isolated, cultured from the feces of harbor seals that were in rehab up here in the Northwest. So I'll talk more about the shellfish angle here in a minute. Now, disease in humans, we assume it's going to be similar to what the terrestrial strains present as. So you get a really sudden, acute febrile illness, sort of feel like you've got the flu, you don't feel well. It can wax and wane, so they call it undulant fever in humans. I had a professor in vet school that had acquired this when he was in large animal practice. He attended to an aborted fetus. They did not know this animal had Brucella, and it splashed up some of the fluids in his eyes. So he had this disease for a very long time, and it just really would knock him out where he'd have to miss school for a couple of weeks. Complications can certainly arise. A lot of itises here, arthritis, spondylitis, which can occur along our backbone, the vertebra, anemia, abscesses, which are, you know, pus pockets, and then certainly could cause some reproductive problems if it affects the testes, and neurological problems. So not another pleasant organism to be dealing with. Now, as far as human cases of marine Brucella, as far as I'm aware of, there might be others that people might let me know of, but we've had 4. One was a laboratory exposure, so we knew that this researcher had contracted it from dealing with tissues of marine mammal tissues that had it, ended up with some headaches, fatigue, but it was resolved after antibiotics. This is another bug that goes and hides in your cells, so it can be very difficult to treat and have to go on antibiotics for a long time. As far as naturally acquired infections of marine Brucella in humans, there are 3 that we know that at least been published. Infection sources are undetermined at this point. So with 2 of them, these were people that ended up with brain abscesses. They survived. The only contact they had with anything marine related was swimming in the ocean. They did off the coast of South America, or I think it was Peru, yeah, Peru. They didn't have any exposure to marine mammals, direct contact. They had not touched tissues. They did have history of raw fish consumption and unpasteurized cheese consumption, which are some of the, we know with unpasteurized cheese, sometimes you can get the goat version or sheep version of that if you have milk and raw cheese from those sources. The other case was a New Zealand fisherman that did have a history of raw fish contact just by virtue of his occupation, but he had also eaten shellfish and consumed raw fish, and also did not have any history of marine mammal contact. So that kind of leaves it, you know, do fish play a role? If so, you know, what role, or is it their parasites that they carry may play a role? And there have been case reports in the literature of parasites in both porpoises, some other dolphins, and harbor seals that have had Brucella isolated from them, and in some cases even marine Brucella. So that's, that still has to be determined, that exact route, if they are indeed involved in transmission, which I'm highly suspect of. So leptospirosis, this is a really interesting bacteria. It's kind of a corkscrew shape, so we call it a spirochete. It has a kind of a spiral shape. It's considered emerging in some areas of the world and re-emerging in others. It is been around a long, long time. Many different types of animals, mammals get them. It can be, dogs, cattle, pigs, humans, rodents, rats especially. So any type of mammal can get it. I know some antibodies have been detected in birds. Whether that's actually a cause of disease, we don't know. There's a lot of study going on right now, quite a bit down in California with the transmission cycle. What is it between, is it terrestrial mammals? Is it, rodents? Is it like coyotes or something else? What is it between California sea lions? And that's still being kind of worked out. In studies that they've done, environmental studies looking at leptospirosis around the world, there have been associations with heavy rain. So we're going to see it in places where there's heavy rainfall, like Hawaii. It's endemic there in some parts of Hawaii, Bangladesh, dog parks, because dogs can also get it, heavy, cattle ranches, and also in areas of high human population density, probably due to the presence of rats. In human studies, especially in the human literature, it's been associated with proximity to both domestic and wild animals. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what we see up here in the Northwest. We typically see these big sea lions that come up here. Usually male adults are coming up to eat salmon. They've left the breeding grounds down in Southern California. They'll get this swelling back here at the end here. They don't typically get up on our porches and sit there and not move. Or they may be lying, just depressed, as you see in this bottom picture. But they'll be, poor nutritional condition. They're lethargic. They're weak. They don't want to use their hind ends. They're painful. Those kidneys are swollen, very painful. We'll see them drink fresh water, which normally they don't, because they get that usually from their food sources, all the water they need. But if they're dehydrated and not eating, they're going to want to seek out sources of fresh water. Occasionally they'll be icteric or jaundice, yellow in the whites of their eyes and their tissues. Up here in the Northwest, we typically see them, the cases during August through December. That's when these big male sea lions show up. We did see a case, potentially a case in April, so that may be the earliest record for us in the Northwest. It's still getting looked at by the pathologist. In California, you get a lot of juveniles because they're coming off the breeding grounds, and in Washington, again, up here, mainly adult and subadult. In Washington, my colleagues at the Fish and Wildlife Service have looked at other species and have found confirmed titers and infections in other pinniped species, such as stellar sea lions and harbor seals. But this is really the big species that we see it in the sea lions. Now in humans, there have been a few cases in the literature linked to disease in marine mammals. Usually you're going to have exposure by being exposed to contaminated tissues, infected sea lions, whether you're handling a live animal and it urinates on you, because this is usually spread through the organism that's expressed through the urine. Whether it's through a necropsy, if you're becoming exposed to infected tissues that way. In humans, like it does in other mammals, it's going to cause this really acute or sudden kidney failure, also liver disease, and it's very, very painful. It can be treated by antibiotics, and it's just a matter of getting recognized sooner rather than later. Now, exposure on the beach, the reason I bring this up is we did have a case in Washington State a few years ago of a stellar sea lion that showed up on the beach. She ended up dying and was diagnosed with leptospirosis, but before she died, she urinated in the sand. And this is not an organism that we typically say is tough in the saltwater environment. In other words, it doesn't persist in the saltwater environment for very long. But we collected some sand, my colleague did, and they were able to culture this organism out of the sand. So that sort of begs the question, looking at this One Health and epidemiology, is what is that risk to humans? Having this organism in the environment, some sea lion urinates, leaves, half an hour later, here comes the kids playing in the sand, or a dog sniffing around. Could they potentially get that? Or, another animal, like a coyote, something that goes along the beach. So just things to think about in this One Health context. This is Mycoplasma. It's something that's been around known by sealers, people that hunt seals and work with seals for hundreds of years. Nasty organism, it's painful. It's usually something that's found normally in pinniped mouths. It can be spread by a bite, handling pelts, or if you get a cut, say from a knife that has been involved in processing seal tissues that had the organism in it. And it's something that it's kind of difficult to diagnose in the sense that unless you bring it to an attention of, you know, not your pediatrician, your doctor, your primary care physician, or whoever your doctor is, your healthcare provider, you want to let them know that you have been, if you have a history of getting bites or wounds, or think you have after working with seals or seal products, because it can be difficult to diagnose. The Mycoplasma is a fastidious grower in the lab. It doesn't like to culture out very well. So typically what will happen is you tell your doctor, hey, I've been around this. They'll say, okay, we'll put you on some different antibiotics than what we would typically treat. Usually things like doxycycline or tetracycline. These are not easy bugs to get unless you have the right antibiotics. And I just want to show more pictures because it can get quite severe. It can work your way up the joints, can spread, you know, to the wrist, and it's very, very painful. And I'll show one last picture. This is a person, a case report. They had quite a bit of inflammation secondary to a seal bite. It did eventually go down with antibiotics on the right-hand side, but every once in a while you can get complications like you see in the lower left where you have to have tissue removed, and then you have to have that sewn back up, or you can have, like this x-ray shows that you have bone damage when the infection goes into the bone. So it's not something to treat lightly if you say, oh gosh, I've had a swollen finger after going into the water, or, you know, dealing with a pinniped. You definitely want to see a doctor right away. So as far as the viruses, we'll touch on a couple of these. The Poxvirus can be transmitted by human contact directly. Usually we see it more in pinnipeds. You'll get these, luckily they're self-limiting, you get these little lesions, but again, it's something you want to be aware of and watch it to see if it spreads. In the animals, we'll see raised nodules. Sometimes we'll see, you know, bumps on the tongue, particularly in stranded pinnipeds. They're stressed already. They're not doing well when they come in. Pups, their immune systems aren't built up yet. And we can get crowded conditions where this can pass. Now, if this person in the middle here with this animal that has a big lesion on its back, I certainly would want to have gloves nowadays. Influenza A, it's something that can cause, we've had outbreaks in pinnipeds and cetaceans along the New England coast. It can have quite high losses. There was an avian influenza outbreak in 2011. It affected about 160 harbor seals in New England. And what was really interesting about this, note it's an avian influenza, but it had demonstrated on further study that it had acquired some mutations that allowed it to adapt to mammals. So that helped increase the transmissibility and virulence in mammals. And so you think about if you're going to be responding to these animals and trying to bring the sick ones into rehab, or you know, having to move them from the beach, or having to necropsy ones that have died, the potential to get exposed to that is quite high. So obviously wearing the proper protective equipment is very vital to do that. And I just had this neat little picture graphic here that shows you some of the different ways. You know, here's a second disease after that Mycobacterium, where you can have transmission, zoonotic transmission both ways between humans and animals, going both ways. But you can see that, you know, birds can transmit to cetaceans, they can transmit to humans, so all kinds of ways. Now, we can't have this talk without our coronavirus. There are about 40 species in this family of Coronaviridae. There are more being, you know, discovered, so this is not all inclusive. Now, the big question is, can marine mammals get coronaviruses? Yes, they can. There have been case reports in several species. These are mostly just single occurrences, maybe 2 animals, and these have mostly been animals in managed care. They have not been the same species as the one that's causing the COVID-19 virus or outbreak. You know, we want to be concerned about the potential for coronavirus affecting our marine mammal collections and those in the wild. But really at this point, there are other virus families that tend to cause more problems in our marine mammal populations, like morbillivirus or distemper viruses, and also our influenza, as we just saw. Now, where marine animals will come in importance for humans is whether there's contamination of water by feces, because we've had SARS, which we had in the early 2000s. We've had the MERS, which is the Middle East respiratory syndrome that was associated with camels. But if these viruses can indeed be shed by fecal route, which they have detected in the feces of humans that have been affected at least by this current COVID, what does that mean for water treatment facilities and maintaining clean water sources and making sure that we don't have that. So there are ongoing efforts to test outflow sites from water treatment facilities to make sure that that we don't detect that, and if we do, what to take measures to help mitigate spread of that virus from a water source to humans. And there are ongoing efforts to help develop COVID tests and to determine the importance of this virus in marine mammals. So there's certainly studies going on, and just they're not done yet. Now, just so happens that last month, the Food and Agriculture Organization, which is an agency of the United Nations, which helps ensure worldwide food safety, which includes fisheries, they put out this report that is basically a qualitative exposure assessment of humans and terrestrial animals to COVID-19 from all these other animals that are listed on there, including aquatic animals. So I thought it was quite timely that they had that. So what they found is that the likelihood of exposure of humans or animals on land to this SARS-CoV coronavirus 2 in COVID-affected areas through contact with aquatic animals, and they didn't really specify what kind of contact, but at this point they consider it negligible. In other words, extremely unlikely to occur from all these aquatic species, with the exception of captive dolphins. And I thought that was kind of odd. And the only explanation they gave is the likelihood of exposure really can't be assessed right now because they didn't have enough data on captive dolphins. And I thought that was kind of odd because that is something that we do have, quite a number of around the world. So, we'll see what happens. And then, this will, the only thing they said is it would be updated as more data. So this will likely change as more information from our partners in aquaria and parks, provide this information. We can update this and not necessarily have it unavailable information. And also today, I just found a report that came out last month. Also, the Navy Marine Mammal Program discovered some new dolphin coronaviruses in their population. It was published last month from 2019. Again, these are not the same COVID-19 coronavirus. These are more specific to dolphins, and just add on, I think there's a couple other dolphin-specific coronaviruses that have been discovered in the past, but this just adds to that growing knowledge. So let's talk about, as we wrap this up, what are some possible sources of exposure? We've seen some, we talked about some, researchers, stranding responders, a whole list goes on. Something to also think about, some of our subsistence hunters, they eat some of these animals that may be affected. They also, harvest tissues from them that are of cultural significance. And I found this picture when I was putting this together, and I thought this was really interesting. Too bad this is not like we can talk one-on-one here right away, but I just thought this was odd. This is a fish processing plant, and we have someone here not wearing gloves. The next one is wearing gloves, and the next one's wearing gloves and sleeves, and this one's got, rubber gloves and sleeves. So I wasn't quite sure why we had the different levels of protection, but it's certainly something that, as for handling fish, you want to be a little bit, sort of along these lines, and also wear a face mask. And this picture just kind of at the bottom just sort of speaks for itself. So just kind of reviewing some health guidelines. We know marine mammals, fish also, but at least with this last part, that marine mammals can carry diseases and that can be transferred to humans and other animals, such as our pets. So as this photo nicely shows, you definitely want to keep yourself, kids, and pets away. If you do have to handle a marine organism that may or may not contain disease, you always want to wear gloves. Protective gear. You want to wash your hands thoroughly after you contact it, even if you're wearing gloves. Particularly if you're bitten or injured in any way, seek professional medical attention, particularly if you start having any swelling or start feeling bad afterwards, like within the next few hours or a couple of days. And definitely consult your physician if you're thinking about working with marine mammals, particularly if you have any type of immunocompromisation or are concerned about health, what to look for. For what we do with strandings, this is a picture of me a few years ago. It was August, it was hot. Taken a number of years ago, before we would be wearing all this type of protection. If this was today, we would definitely be wearing Tyvek gloves, we'd have goggles, masks to try to protect us. Yes, it does get hot, but again, we don't want to risk getting something that we don't want to take home with us. And we can't always prevent being touched by fluids or organisms. So afterwards, we of course take all those clothes off. When we get home, wash ourselves, use lots and lots of scrubbing, and try to use hand sanitizer a lot. So just one last slide, prevention control, again, just a lot of common sense, education about the risk of transmission, using personal protective equipment and wearing it properly. I don't know how many of these people we have going around with their mask and their nose exposed. Trying to avoid exposing your open wounds or broken skin, including tattoos, fresh tattoos, to warm waters, brackish waters, or getting, when you get scratched by shellfish, to seek medical attention for that. Cook your shellfish. I'm not a shellfish eater. I know a lot of people eat them raw, but I'm always going to say cook them. If you do have unopened shellfish after you cook them, not to avoid eating those. Again, refrigeration and keeping cooked versus raw food away from each other, not to cross-contaminate. So I'm going to give a shout out to these two. These are my kids. They are high school senior and junior, left to right, and they have heard mom talk about all kinds of nasty things through the years. So give a shout out to them for, hanging in there and putting up with it. And if you have any questions, feel free to contact me. Here's my information. I can take a couple questions if we have time.
Stephanie, I have, I'll read a couple questions to you. And so we have in the chat room, George and Marissa are asking, gray whales are observed to carry relatively large ectoparasite loads compared to other cetacean. Can you speak to whether gray whales or other marine mammal species are particularly well known to carry diseases?
Well, they don't have any specific to them. I mean, just like any other marine mammal. I'll kind of back up and do cetaceans, because cetaceans can have their own set of diseases versus the pinnipeds, and as you see, they can also share some diseases. But as far as gray whales, I know I have some colleagues on here, so they can certainly chime in too, that are veterinarians and work with marine mammals on the West Coast. So we have performed a lot of necropsies on them, and there have been viruses that have been isolated from them. We have isolated lots of types of bacteria. At this point, it's kind of a mixed bag. What happens with a lot of these animals is we get them in such poor shape, or by the time, at least in Washington State, we'll get an animal show up, and then by the time we make it out to the outer coast, it's like, sometimes a 6-hour drive. They are often in poor condition. So we will get histopathology reports back and culture results showing that they've died of, they'll have salmonella, or they will have, we haven't had any, I think we've had maybe herpes virus. That's a virus we didn't talk about, but we've had a couple with herpes virus, but not anything that's really overwhelmingly shown up and saying, oh my gosh, they're all dying of these things. So I don't know if anyone, I don't know if Heather Harris is on here still, or who other vets that work in California. They may have some other diseases, but I know an encephalitis virus was isolated by Dr. Frances Golan, who was at the Marine Mammal Center. She isolated, I can't remember which type it was, out of a young gray whale when we had our last unusual mortality event back in 1999, 2000. But it's not something we routinely see. But again, by the time we get to these animals, sometimes it's so decomposed that we'll get a lot of contaminant bacteria growing, but not necessarily, the ultimate organism that's cause of death. But good question.
Second question is that what's the risk to the marine mammals from us? I know you kind of touched on this, but I want to sort of share with everybody that you were very good about helping us answer a question that was directed to ACS San Diego about whether whale watching activities, particularly in the lagoon where sometimes it gets a little bit physical, a little bit more intimate, where there's petting of whales, what's the risks of human beings transmitting to the marine environment? You've talked about the other way, but.
Yeah, I would say, you mean going from people to animals or the other way around?
From people to animals.
That's a good question. I don't know. I mean, that's a good question. I don't think there's a for sure answer on that. Things like the tuberculosis, if someone's sick, I hope they wouldn't be there with COVID. We've had some animals obviously show up that have been positive, you know, domestic animals, cats and dogs. And I think a lot of that's still being worked out. As far as marine mammals, I don't know of any, at least COVID cases that have been determined to be, you know, but there's no COVID testing in marine mammals yet. That they're being developed for sure, the testing capabilities. But I mean, certainly things like salmonella, if someone has it. The one thing I think of most commonly would be multi-drug resistant Staphylococcus aureus.
Mm-hmm.
So you have that, you know, a certain portion of the population carries that on their skin. We live with it. We don't, you know, we don't get sick with it. But if there's someone we transfer it to, then yes, there's a potential. So this is just my personal opinion, and I think because it's a calving lagoon, I understand people want to touch them, but I think it would be, I mean, this is going to open a whole nother can of worms. I think either putting gloves on or sanitizing your hands before you touch them. I don't want to introduce a bunch of gloves into the environment because we're already having that problem now, but either minimizing the touching, or if that's going to happen, then should try to use a hand sanitizer pretty thoroughly if that touching is going to take place. Because we got to remember there are calves down there and their immune systems haven't been built up yet. There may be ill adults down there also. So, but yes, things like salmonella can certainly transport you know, the resistant Staphylococcus bacterial infections that cause all the, you know, the flesh eating. Certainly those are potentials.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you. Let's see if anybody wants to jump in and unmute and ask a question to Dr. Norman.
I'm going to stop sharing so I can see folks.
It's good contact information.
It's a lot of whale doc in there so you can remember.
Or if anybody wants to add to the chat room a question, I'd be happy to answer it. Jane wants to go. Yes.
So when we're out whale watching, sometimes we get surprised with the whale popping up pretty close, and it does its lovely little spray, and we get kind of glittered with it. Is this something that could be transferred, any type of disease, if we were like laughing and got to inhale that lovely stuff? Or
well, if they have a respiratory infection, which actually marine mammals do get a lot of, just by virtue of sort of how their respiratory system's built, but they do get, I would say, they're disproportionately represented in the world of animal respiratory disease. So if they are carrying something like, I don't know, say an E. coli, and they were to spray, so yes, potentially, I would say probably in a healthy person, if they wash their face afterwards, or, you know, carry some type of a water bottle and wash their face off well, and then when they get back to shore, you know, wash soap and water. Yeah, they potentially, but I'd be more worried about people that are immunocompromised that are out there, that, you know, if they happen to touch their face, salmonella's on their hand, you know, we all touch our mouth, chew our fingers, rub our eyes. It's those type of actions, and I've caught myself doing that. I've been sprayed in the face by, you know, marine mammals before, and the first thing I do is I just get a bottle of water and flush as much as I can. If I can get to like after I do a necropsy or have handled an animal, I immediately go to the bathroom and to a place where I can hand washing station and use soap and water to wash up, just because, you know, I don't want to risk it. But I don't think there's an extra ordinary risk of a healthy animal coming up. Yes, you could get some bacteria sprayed. They have bacteria in their respiratory tract. We all do. So I guess it's like kind of like equated to sneezing in someone's face. We're worried about that with COVID now, but in non-COVID times, yeah, it's kind of gross more than anything. But I think using good common sense and washing yourself can help mitigate any problems, or at least most problems in the future.
thank you.
We have another question in the chat room, and that is, are there any situations where you treat wild marine mammals if there was an outbreak of a disease? And then you might be getting a partial answer from Carrie Mahoney that says toxoplasmosis to sea otters from cats. So those might somehow go together.
Yeah, so so she's asking whether we would actually treat animals in the wild?
I believe so. That
Yeah.
would marine scientists, marine veterinarians like yourself, if we knew that there was a wild, I kind of interpret it if there was some sort of a wild outbreak.
Yeah, that's a good question. It really depends on a number of factors. One, what disease are you dealing with? What population are you dealing with? So if you have, and not to assign more worth to one population over another, but when you're talking about something like the otters that are struggling along the coast there, the monk seals out in Hawaii, all it takes is one pandemic to wipe these animals out. So what we try to do is try to assess, what is the risk? If we do treat, is it a treatable disease? Toxoplasma is notoriously hard to treat, even in cats. I mean, they get it in cats, and cats are, it's one of the things we worry about getting from the cat feces. But as far as, say a disease like influenza, probably, it depends on how affected they are. If they're mildly affected and there's room to rehab them, there are the resources to contribute to that. It's not something like an Ebola, but like maybe an influenza, then yes, potentially could treat. I know that rehab facilities and places that would take in, like SeaWorld would, not going to want to take in something that's highly infectious like that, because it's going to pose a risk to their own animals and their collections. But also if you have other rehabbing animals and you bring in something that has a very virulent or a very contagious disease, you run the risk of infecting everybody. And if it's very zoonotic, then you run the risk of infecting not only the staff, but your volunteers also. So it's just going to depend on the population of animal, the disease you're dealing with. Are they an endangered population of marine mammals? Is everyone critical, such as monk seal? Then I would say yes, in that case you would. Otters, likely also, if it's something treatable, at least, give it an attempt. They maybe have other vets online if they still are, may have some other input.
That the original question about wild marine mammals, the person has said, I was really asking about cetaceans and pinnipeds. And then Robin Cates has entered into the chat room to say Hawaiian monk seals have been trial vaxxed.
Yes.
Yep. So.
Yeah, so sometimes it's better to head off the disease, but again, you're dealing with a small population that's impacted by humans, by disease, by their environment. So things like harbor seals up here, if we had an outbreak of something, we probably wouldn't take them in to treat them, just depending on what it was. If we had an unusual cetacean come up here that was sick, then yes, we might try it. It just depends on what the likelihood of them surviving, again, what pathogen, what disease we're dealing with. Limited resources, limited space. It's just that's gonna help. That's gonna play into the decision.
Thank you. I'm just gonna remind everybody that we are recording this, and that we will, it takes hours for Zoom to process it, that they will let us know when the link is available, and we will post that link on the ACS San Diego website, so probably tomorrow. And I would like to send it back to Jane. Don't forget to unmute, Jane.
One quick question one quick thing I want to add. Remember too that we're looking at populations. So when you're looking at at least from an epidemiological perspective, we look at individual animals, but really what we have to keep in mind is what's best for the population. What's going to keep it strong, what's going to help recover it if it's endangered or threatened. So just to kind of think of it in terms of just like public health with the COVID, what kind of treatments are we trying to help the population as a whole? So vaccines are figuring into it, antibody treatments or antibody plasma treatments, and also some of the antivirals. So it's a population level that you start really wanting to keep in mind and forefront.
Super.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stephanie. That was absolutely enlightening. Learned a lot and really appreciated. Well done. I'd like to say good night, and hopefully we'll all see you next month. Have a good night.
And add your name to the chat room if you want us to email you. Thanks again, Dr. Norman.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Sorry for the slow start.
It's all right.